Hi, I'm Mike Dennis. I'm back for the second installment of this series of videos that is going to be basically my life story with a special focus on my life in music as a pianist. I'm speaking to you, as before, from beautiful downtown Panama City, a great town if ever there was one, and I am sitting at my piano. As you can see, there it is, and I hope that this installment will go smoothly, and that I will be able to communicate what I intend to tell you. Now, last episode we left off, I was just about to rent a piano after having been so turned on by watching Dr. John on TV. I was living in Houston, Texas. The year was 1973. I was 28 years old, and I had been working in advertising for a number of years and had not sat down at a piano, not even sat down at a piano for about 6 years. So I rented a piano, and they brought, the next day they brought it in. It was a little Wurlitzer Spinet, acoustic piano. And I was very tentative after they left. I didn't go run right over and sit down. I was very tentative because I knew I hadn't played, and I hadn't even sat down at a piano in 6 years. So I was very almost afraid. But I went over and I sat down, and now I realize why I was afraid, because I had lost everything. I couldn't play hardly even a C chord, and I had to relearn everything. I had to relearn everything that Pop Curry taught me, and all of the, just everything. And I came a little quicker this time around because I had already known it at one time. It wasn't all new to me, so I had to. It did come quicker, but I had to. Nevertheless, I had to bring it back. I had to relearn it, and so once I got. It took a couple days to get all that out of the way. And then I set my turntable on the piano bench next to me, and I put on the Dr. John album that contained Stacca Lee and the Mess Around, and I played the first couple of notes of Stacca Lee, and lifted up the needle, and then tried to replicate those notes on the piano, and that's how I went through pretty much the whole song. I never did learn the whole song, to tell you the truth. And I did this for 2 hours every day after work. When I come home from work, I did this for 2 hours every single day, and then maybe 4 or 5 hours on the weekends. No kidding. And I did this for months. And one day, after several months of doing this, I hear a knock at the door. And I'm thinking, oh, it's some neighbor. Hey, knock that shit off, will you? And I go to the door, and I open it. And it's this cool-looking guy, about my age, kind of longish hair. And he said, hey, he said, was that you playing the piano? And I said, yeah. And I said, he said, well, I'm a guitar player. Can I come in? So of course I let him in. It was Bob Danaher. Now Bob Danaher turns out to have been next to Pop Curry, maybe the most influential person in my life, next to Pop Curry and my parents. Bob Danaher's influence on me just cannot be overstated. He came in, and I'm convinced, and I'm not. I have to say now, I'm not a religious man, but I am convinced that God sent Bob Danaher to me on that day in 1973. I mean that. I was there playing. I was kind of trying to learn that song, and Bob knocked on the door, and I answered it, and there he was. And it turns out that he was a neighbor. He lived just down the hall. It was a garden apartment, so there were no hallways. It was outside. He lived just right down the way a little bit, just maybe 10 steps down the way, in an apartment right down there. And he lived down there with his pregnant wife, and he was a guitar player. And he told me he was playing at a place called the Cellar Door in Houston. Now, the Cellar Door was a chain of steakhouse restaurants in Houston. They were kind of a family-style restaurant. It was not expensive, but it wasn't cheap. They served good meals, good food. And they had good service and nice atmosphere. It was kind of a lively atmosphere. That Bob was playing guitar there, and he played, Neil Diamond and all that kind of stuff that most of those guitar players did at the time. And anyway, so we got to be friends. And he was a really nice guy. He introduced me to his wife, Connie. She was very nice. She was maybe 6 or 7 months pregnant at the time. And so, no, not 6 or 7 months. What am I saying? She was maybe 4 or 5 months. So anyway, we became friends, and he would come over to my place, and I would go over to his. And when he'd come over to my place, he'd break out his guitar, he'd play a tune, and I'd try to follow him along. I can remember, I'm just now getting back. I'm like brand new at playing, even though I'm 28 years old, and I'm just really getting my feet wet with playing again, because I hadn't played in 6 years. And so he would play a song, and I'd try to follow him along, and and he'd do Sweet Caroline, what was that? And I'd learn that on the piano, and we'd get a version of that going. And so anyway, he enjoyed my company, and I enjoyed his. So we really got along, and I would go to see him every once in a while at the cellar door. He played early hours, I think 7 to 11, something like that. Wasn't really outrageously late. And after he got home, he would come over to my place quite often, knock on my door, and invite me over to his place, and we'd smoke a little dope and watch TV with his wife. And so anyway, that was our relationship for quite a while, until one day, a couple months later, he said, "Listen, Mike," he said, I got a gig coming up. It's a wedding. They want me to play this wedding at a church right down the street here, and it's May 19th, and I forget what it paid. I don't know, $50 or something like that. He said, and I told him that it was me and a piano player. So you want to do it? So I said, sure. So I remembered May 19th, because this was my first paid gig since I quit playing that night in 1967 with the New Breed. Now, I was not yet a professional musician, of course, because I was still working in advertising, and this was just one gig with Bob. But we played, we went in and played the wedding, and the first song we played was The Wedding Song by Paul Stuckey, and the second one was, then they got married, they had the ceremony, they got married, and then we played We've Only Just Begun, which I thought was nice. And everybody liked it, and everybody was happy, Bob was happy, I was happy, and we got our money and we went home. So anyway, along about maybe a couple of months later, now it's like maybe August, September, Bob says to me, why don't you come play with me at the cellar door? They've been talking about upping their entertainment budget. He says, why don't you come play with me on Friday and Saturday nights, at the cellar door? And I've talked to them, they approved it, they said they'll pay you, and so everything will be copacetic. So I said, sure. He said, but you have to have an electric piano. You have to bring some kind of keyboard in. So I went out and I scored a used Fender Rhodes electric piano, which I like those pianos, and that they have a very distinctive sound to them if you're not familiar with them. But they're still a piano, and I really liked it, and I came in and I slid right in behind Bob. And during that time, between the time he asked me to and the time we started playing in the middle of September, we had worked up quite a few of his songs so that we could play them on Friday and Saturday nights. The Monday through Thursday nights, he was playing by himself, but Friday and Saturdays, I played with him. And it was just wonderful being back playing again in public. It was just wonderful. And so I got paid. I don't remember what I was paid, but anyway, it was a moment, a milestone moment for me. We played 2 nights a week, and it was during this period of time, during this September of 1973, that I met a guy named Big Walter. Now, Big Walter was an old black blues man from Houston. He had been around forever. At the time, he was, I think, pushing 60, and but he had been around in the 1950s. He had a hit record in the 1950s called Shirley Jean on the Peacock label, and then he had a few other records after that. And then as the 60s wore into the 70s, he had a version of Pack Fair and Square, which was done by the Jay Giles Band, but he had a really hot version of that. But Shirley Jean was his big claim to fame, and he was a piano player and a blues singer, and he played and sang by himself, and that was his thing. That was what he did. And I went to hear him at a place called the Place Pigalle. Sounds like a high-class joint, right? But it was really just a low-down, run-down place over on West Alabama. in Houston, and we became friends. I told Big Walter that I was a piano player, that I was just getting back into it, and he came over to my house, to my apartment, I should say, and I had my little Rhodes set up there, and he, no, excuse me, I still had the rented Wurlitzer. I still had the rented Wurlitzer. And anyway, he came over and he sat down and he played a few things and showed me how to play things. He showed me one thing I remember that was from a song he had called "A Long Way to Go, Short Time to Make It." And it was this little lick right here. I'll never forget him showing me that. I thought that was the hottest little riff, and he showed me how to do it, and he made me promise. He said, "Now you got to promise you will never do this in a song. I'm showing you how to do this, but you got to promise you'll never do it in a song, because this is my riff. I made it up, and I want to be the only one to do it. You're the only person I've ever shown it to, Mike." So I felt honored that I would be the only person that he would show that to. So I kept my word. I never did use that riff in a song, but I always remembered it. Anyway, Big Walter and I became friends, and he became a great inspiration to me. He would give me little tips on what to do during a gig and how to conduct myself. And all the while now, meanwhile, I'm still working in advertising, and I'm only playing 2 nights a week with Bob Danaher. But it was as though Walter could see the future, because he would tell me, this is what you got to do when you're playing in this kind of place and that kind of place, and when you got this kind of crowd. And he's giving me all these little tips that he's picked up over the decades that he'd been in the business. I mean, it was a great treasure trove of information that he gave me, and I was forever grateful to him for it. And we always remained friends after that. May he rest in peace. He passed away, I want to say maybe 10 years ago or so, at the age of 97. But anyway, we remained friends pretty much throughout the rest of his life. So anyway, along about October, around the first or second week of October, Bob and I are still playing at the Cellar Door, and he pulls me aside one night after a Saturday night, and he says, "Listen, Mike," he said, "the Cellar Door wants to take you on full time, and so do I. I want you to join me full time, and we'll have the duo of Danaher and Bunis." That was going to be the name of the duo. He said, "But you've got to quit your job in the advertising business. You have to quit your day job." Well, now this was something that secretly I'd always hoped for. I'd always hoped that somebody would tell me that. And yet I didn't jump at it right away, because I had to consider all the ramifications. As it turned out, the work he had lined up was he said, "Now we're gonna do 5 weeks. We're gonna play 5 weeks before we go to the Cellar Door. We're gonna do 5 weeks in Austin at the Lakeway Inn on Lake Travis." Lakeway Inn was a nice little motel, lodge, I should say, out on Lake Travis outside Austin. Beautiful setting. It was a beautiful little place, and they had a lounge in there that where they had live entertainment, and we were going to play there 6 nights a week for 5 weeks. He said, "Now after that, if we hold it together, and if everything works out, meaning if I don't fuck it up, then we can come back to the Cellar Door. But that's how the Cellar Door wants it, and that's how I want it. So what do you say?" So essentially what he was telling me was, I have to give up my career in advertising for 5 weeks at the Lakeway Inn, and who knows if there's anything at all on the other side of it. Now this was a big fork in the road for me, needless to say, like this. And down this fork, I could see that this was the advertising fork. I could have taken that road, and it was brightly lit. I could see all the way down it. I could see where I was going in advertising. It was brightly lit and gay, and not gay, homosexual, but joyful, and it had all the promise that my career held for me. Down the other fork, was 5 weeks at Lakeway, was dark and rainy, and strange noises were coming from it, and it was very intimidating and mysterious, and it was kind of forbidding. So that was the road I took, of course. But I did have to go home and think about it. I told Bob that I wanted to think about it. I did have to think about it, and because I liked advertising. Believe me, I liked that work, and I was doing very well at it, and I could have gone quite a long ways in it. Everybody liked me. My clients liked me. I was good at it, and I mean, it was. I enjoyed going to work, but this was something that I secretly always wanted, and I knew. I told myself that night when I got home, I said, "Listen, Mike, you know that if you don't take this opportunity, that you're always going to wonder whatever would have become, whatever would have happened had you taken it. You're always going to wonder that, and if you do take it, you're not going to wonder what would have happened if you had stayed in advertising, because you know what would have happened, and and this is what you want to do. This is your passion, so you have to take it." This was the discussion I was having with myself, and so of course I called Bob the next day and told him I would be delighted to take it, and that was a Sunday. And then that Monday, I went in. He said, "All right, we're going to open up 2 weeks from tomorrow. That would be October 23rd, and at Lakeway. And we'll leave 2 weeks from today, Sunday. We'll leave 2 weeks from today and go up and get settled in our rooms and everything." And we had rooms and a discount on meals was the deal that we had at Lakeway, and of course being paid. But that Monday, the first day after I told Bob that I would do it, I went in and gave my notice at the advertising agency, and they thought I had gone crazy. They thought I had flipped out. They said, "What? You're quitting advertising to play music?" I didn't want to tell them that I was making at Lakeway more than they were paying me in the advertising business, at the advertising agency. But and at Lakeway, I wasn't really getting rich. I was just making kind of entry level wages at Lakeway. But anyway, I said, I told them, yes, that's what I want to do, and they finally understood, and they wished me well. I gave them the 2 weeks notice. I worked out the 2 weeks, and they were sorry to see me go, but I did leave at the end of 2 weeks. And I went home and I packed up my piano and my bags, and that Sunday, Bob and his wife, Connie, and I took off in our separate cars, and we bought, I forgot to mention, we each bought a U-Haul trailer, not U-Haul, Easy Haul. Easy Haul was a competitor of U-Haul, and they had recently gone out of business, and they were selling all their trailers. And they had a big lot in Houston where they were selling a bunch of their smaller trailers for, I think it was like $150 a piece. I mean, it was a deal you couldn't turn down. So we each bought one of those trailers, and we hooked it on the back of our vehicles, and Bob had a van, I had a car, and we drove to Austin. And we got there, and October 23rd, 1973, I consider that to be my first professional musician date, the opening date of my career in professional music. Now, right before that, maybe a couple of days before that, before we left town, I went out and bought a leather coat. Now, I bought a leather coat because every musician I'd ever seen, or every musician who I thought was cool that I had ever seen, had a leather coat. And I'm talking about the kind of leather coat that goes all the way down to your knees, And so I went out and bought one of these leather coats, and it cost me about $100. And I was just flabbergasted. I'd never spent that much money on any article of clothing in my life. But $100 for the leather coat, I was happy to spend it because now I felt like a professional musician. I really did. And so I packed my leather coat, and we drove to Austin. On October 23rd, we opened up the Lakeway Inn. I remember the first song we played was If You Could Read My Mind by Gordon Lightfoot. Bob really sang that song very well. And we played there. We got through the first night, great. We got through the whole 5 weeks, great. Bob said, "There's not going to be any problem with you, Mike. We're gonna do great. I'm gonna call the cellar door and tell them that you're coming in," and we did, and it was, everything worked out. So from November '73, which is when we closed at Lakeway, to February '74, we played the cellar door 6 nights a week, and now during this period, a couple of things dawned on me during this period, November 73 to February 74. First of all, I got used to going to work every night at 7 o'clock to play with Bob at the cellar door and having my days free. I really enjoyed that. I would go to movies during the day, and then, I didn't have to put up with any traffic, and everything was really wonderful. And I went in and played music, and I had a great time with Bob. Bob was a great guy, and then afterward we go back to his apartment and smoke dope with Connie. Not she was pregnant, she wouldn't smoke, but we'd watch TV. I remember we used to watch the Midnight Special, Wolfman Jack. Remember him? All right, and that show In Concert, Don Kirshner In Concert, and we used to watch those kind of shows late at night. But anyway, during this period, November 73 to February 74, I began to realize that there was no pension waiting for me down at the end of the road, that I was going to have to provide for myself. And I wasn't making a lot of money right now. Granted, I was only 28 years old, but I wasn't making a lot of money, and it could very easily work into the fact that I was never going to make a lot of money. But I had to be very careful with my money, and I had to be very careful to make sure that every gig I took had to be better than the last one I left. Now, better in the terms of making more money, or more prestige, or more challenging musically, but there had to be something that I could point to that said, that is a better gig, this is a better gig than what I just left. And I knew that whenever I left Bob Danaher, whenever that would be, and I wasn't counting on it, but whenever I did leave him, if I left him, that the gig I took after that was going to have to be better. And I just resolved myself that that's the way it was going to be. I could not settle for any lateral moves, because I'd seen guys around Houston who had lateral moves, and they become stuck in a rut, and they couldn't get out. And I did not want that to happen to me. All right, also along about this time, it dawned on me that I really established my goal in life. And it sounds like a very simple goal, and in fact it is, but it was not simple to achieve. My goal in life that I projected for myself at that time, and still is to a degree, was to play music every night and get paid for it. I did not want to become famous or rich or anything like that. I just wanted to play music every night and get paid for it. To be able to get up in the morning and say, I get to play music tonight. That's what I wanted. And that's what I did. I accomplished that goal. Now, of course, I haven't played music every single night since 1974, but most of them, and even though there were a few years where I backed away from music since then, I still had that goal. I mean, I still felt like I had succeeded in life, that I was a roaring success in life, because I identified my passion, what I really, really, truly wanted to do in my heart. I identified it and went ahead and executed it, and I did it. So I'm very proud of myself for having done that. Anyway, February 1974 rolls around, and Bob says, I think we ought to go on the road, because we need to get out on the road and take our act out to the country and see what happens. So he said, but before we do, so he got a booking agent, and the booking agent. But first we went back to the Lakeway Inn for another 4 or 5 weeks, just to kind of get our feet wet with being out of town again. Then the booking agent booked us 1 month back in Houston, ironically, at a steak and ale restaurant from March to April 74. We played February to March 74 at the Lakeway Inn again. Then March to April 74, we played at the Steak and Ale. Now, I don't know if you remember, but Steak and Ale was a nationwide chain of restaurants back in those days, and they were pretty nice. They weren't fancy, but they had very dark wood and everything was dark, and they served, good portions of steak on big dark pewter platters, and the food was very good, the service was good, and they always had entertainment in these places, and they were all over the country. Steak and Ale, and I don't know if I think they're all gone now, but back then they were just about everywhere you looked. Anyway, we played a Steak and Ale in Houston, And by this time, we had given up our apartments to save money. So we got a hotel room. There was a hotel right next to the Steak and Ale where we were playing, that just happened to be managed by the guy who managed Lakeway Inn the first time we were there in October, and he loved us. So he gave us a really good deal on a hotel room. Like, we couldn't resist it, we couldn't turn it down. And so we played at this hotel we played at the Steak and Ale, I should say, and stayed at that hotel for the month of, for March to April of '74. Then April to May of '74, the agent booked us at a Steak and Ale in Buffalo. Now this Buffalo gig, we opened Monday night after having closed Saturday night in Houston. So that meant Saturday night we had to pack our stuff into our cars and trailers and drive straight through all the way to Buffalo. Saturday, Sunday, and we got there Monday morning, I think. And I collapsed and we got a hotel room, and I collapsed and we went down, set up later that day and set up, and we played that night. And we did, I think, 4 or 5 weeks there. And everything went fine in Buffalo. Then the agent booked us May through June at a Steak and Ale in Pittsburgh. And we got down to Pittsburgh and we played there, and that went fine. And then we played the month of July and a portion of August at a Sheraton Hotel in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And this was McKeesport was kind of a rough and tumble kind of town, just south of Pittsburgh. It's I think south or east maybe. It's a suburb of Pittsburgh, but it's a very rough and tumble kind of place. They had a steel mill there. That was what they were famous for. And we got a lot of the steel mill crowd in the lounge of this hotel where we were playing. And they also had hookers who worked this lounge. And the manager of the place, I began to think might have had organized crime ties. I wasn't too sure, but that's what I thought. Anyway, we were held over at the McKeesport at the Sheraton McKeesport for another couple of weeks or so, and that was great. Our agent thought that was great, and the manager of the hotel loved us. And then on our last day there, after we finished playing, we had all our stuff packed up. He called us into his office and he said, "Look, you guys," he said, "I think you guys are great." And he said, I think you have a great future in front of you, and I want to be your manager. I want to be your business manager. Now, if we sign a contract where I'm your business manager, I will make a phone call and put you in Las Vegas. I can make another phone call and put you on the Tonight Show, just like that. And we were looking at each other, Bob and I, this was like totally, we were unprepared for this, just totally unprepared. So, but nevertheless, that's what this guy was telling us. Now, of course, by now, we're positive that he's got organized crime ties, because only organized crime people can pick up the phone and get you a gig, an unknown person, a gig in Las Vegas and on the Tonight Show. But nevertheless, that's what he was promising. So we talked about it that night in our hotel room, and we decided that we shouldn't do it because we didn't want to be beholden to organized crime, for the rest of our lives, which essentially would have been what it was. We'd just have to do what they said from that moment forward. Now, that may not be all that bad, because we'd be playing in Las Vegas, occasional stint on the Tonight Show, and God knows what else. But and we'd probably be making pretty good money. But they'd be taking a big cut of it, and we'd have to do everything they said without any argument. And we weren't quite ready for that. I was still a newbie. I was not ready for anything like this. I was still really kind of learning how to play, much less playing Las Vegas. But anyway, so we politely declined his invitation, and we told him we didn't want to tie ourselves up, and we had other things in front of us. So our booking agent booked us in August in a Holiday Inn in Warrendale, Pennsylvania, another little ways outside Pittsburgh. And we played there, and that went okay. And then August '74, we played 2 weeks at a Holiday Inn in Cumberland, Maryland, and then Holiday Inn back at Warrendale again. And then we were out of work for a little while, for a couple of weeks, and we drove up a road from Pittsburgh to Erie, and we passed through this town of Zelienople. And there's a place, a little roadside joint there called the Blue Flame. And we stopped in and asked the guy if we could play there. We gave him a price, and he said sure. So we played Friday and Saturday night, and we were billed below the stripper, which was at the Blue Flame. So we played there. All right, now September rolls around, '74, and our booking agent booked us at the Holiday Inn in Frederick, Maryland, which is north of Washington, D.C. And so we played the Holiday Inn at Frederick, and that was a really good room. We liked it. And then in October, she booked us at the Travelodge, in Huntsville, Texas, which is north of Houston, about an hour's drive north of Houston, where the Texas State Prison is. And so we played at the Travelodge in October 1974 in Huntsville, Texas. Then November of '74, after Huntsville, we played Montego Bay Motel up in Lawton, Oklahoma. And we went up there, and it was a beautiful room. It's much better than it sounds. It was a big room, and the motel was a big motel, and it was a big place in Lawton, Oklahoma, very popular place locally, and they got a big crowd, along with a big local crowd and a big crowd from the hotel. So we did very well there. And then after that, we played the Lamplighter in Lake Jackson, Texas for a week, and that was down south of Houston. And then finally, in December of '74, we'd go back to the Cellar Door. And, we were fresh off being on the road for the better part of a year. And we came back, we got ourselves places to live. And by now, Connie, Bob's wife, had her baby. She had her baby, I think it was sometime around Christmas, '73. And I should mention, she had the baby Christmas of '73, and then she took the baby along on the road with Bob and I the whole of 1974. So the baby was with us the whole of 1974. His name was Kelly, and he was just the cutest little guy you've ever seen. Anyway, so he was with us the whole of '74. But then we're back in the Cellar Door in December '74, fresh off the road, and we played there through January of '75. January of '75, we go to a Travelodge in Austin, Texas, and then February, back to the Cellar Door in February of '75, where we played the Cellar Door February through May. Now in May, we go back on the road again. Our agent books us at the Golden Rooster in Odessa, in Odessa, Texas, far west Texas. And this was way out in West Texas, and the Golden Rooster was a hotel in downtown Odessa with a beautiful lounge, and they had a casino on the 4th floor. So I think that they were part of a sort of a Texas organized crime, Texas mafia kind of setup. And as it turns out, they were. So we played the Golden Rooster in June of 1975. And then from July to August of '75, we played the Cellar Door, back to the Cellar Door in Houston. August to September of '75, we played the Holiday Inn in Farmington, New Mexico. Our agent booked us there. And again, every time I mention these places we have to play, it's like we close Saturday night and then open Monday night at this next place. Now, Farmington, New Mexico is extreme northwestern New Mexico, and Houston is in extreme southeastern Texas. So we had to drive all the way across Texas and then all the way diagonally up across New Mexico to Farmington. And we had to leave Saturday night when we got done, and we drove all the way through and got there Monday morning. A really tough, punishing drive. But that's what we did, and I didn't mind it because it was a chance to play in Farmington, New Mexico. And we played the Holiday Inn in Farmington, New Mexico. And while we were there, Mickey Gilley was coming through town. He played somewhere in that area and was staying at the Holiday Inn. And he came down into the lounge where we were playing, and of course we recognized him right away. I had met him in Houston. He's from Houston. And so we said, Mickey, you want to get up and do a song? So he got up, and by now I had a Baldwin acoustic electric piano. It was kind of a strange instrument, an 88 key, but it had a soundboard, but it was very compact, and it had strings and everything. But it was the way it was constructed. It sounded sort of like an acoustic piano. And so Mickey got up and he played a couple songs on my piano. I was thrilled to death. And it was a big deal having him sit in on our equipment. And his guitar player sat in with him, used Bob's guitar. And then also while we were there in Farmington, I had the occasion to meet a guy named Sankey Johnson. Now Sankey Johnson, at the time now, I'm 29 years old, 30 years old. And Sankey was 21. And I'll never forget this. And he was, I don't remember how we came to meet him, but I was over at his apartment, and he had a piano there, and he said, let me show you what I just learned. And he sat down and he played that thing from Traffic. I can't remember the name of it, and I used to be able to play it, something like that. I don't know. I don't remember. But it was more complicated than that. But anyway, he played that riff, with both hands, and I was, who's this kid, right? And he starts playing all this rock and roll stuff. Now, by this time, I have to add, Bob and I, by this time, are playing what we called progressive country music. By 1975, all through 74, we started going into progressive country. And now it's called Americana music, but back then it was progressive country, and it was played by Jerry Jeff Walker and Waylon Jennings and Michael Murphy and Willie Nelson and people like that, the Austin crowd, and we were very influenced by this kind of music. And that was a lot of that made up a huge portion of our repertoire. And by this time, that was pretty much all I was listening to, that and country music. And I was not listening to rock and roll anymore. So when Sankey played that riff from Traffic, I'd never heard it before, even though it was apparently some big hit, but I had never heard it. And he looked at me like I was crazy. "You'd never heard this song?" I said, "No." And he starts playing all this other stuff, and he was great, a great player. And I said, "Man," I said, "where are you playing now?" And he said, "Well, we just got back from Wyoming at a band we were playing up there." I said, "What do you got lined up?" He said, "Well, nothing right now." I said, "Nothing? You should be playing everywhere. You should be in California, And he said, "Yeah, I know, but I thought maybe I'd go to Nashville, try to pick up some demo work as a session player." I said, "Well, that's a good idea. Why don't you do that?" He said, "I don't know." And it sounded like he didn't have much ambition, but the guy was great. He was just loaded with talent. If I had 1/10 the talent that he had, and he was 21 years old, right? I wanted to wring his neck. But anyway, Sankey was a good guy. And later on, years later, I Googled him. This was maybe 10 years ago, I think I Googled him. And he was still living in Farmington. He had something to do with the local church there. And I think he pretty much dropped out of music altogether. It's a real shame because the guy was extremely talented. All right, so October 75, we go to the Inn of the Mountain Gods in Ruidoso, New Mexico, which is in kind of east central New Mexico. And the Inn of the Mountain Gods was on an Indian reservation, so it was Indian owned. And it was a really nice place. They had very Indian themed, of course, and the decor, all that was very nice, very tastefully done. And the lounge was nice. And it was there when one of the managers was telling me that they were going to open a casino in the hotel. They were going to add on a casino. And I thought, casino? I said, "But gambling's illegal." He said, "Oh no, not on Indian reservations, because we're a tribe. The tribes are their own sovereign nations, so we can have whatever we want, within reason. Up to a point, we're not governed by the U.S. government, so we can make gambling legal, and then have a casino, and then hire established casino management people out in the world, bring them here to run it for us." And I thought, "God, what a great idea that is, Indian casinos." That's the first I'd ever heard of it. Now, as it turns out, they didn't have the first Indian casino, I don't think. Someone else beat them to it, but that was the first I had heard of it. It took them maybe a few years to get through the red tape and all of the bureaucracy to open the casino, but they finally did. But it was the first I'd ever heard of an Indian casino. And it started with the Inn of the Mountain Gods, the Mescalero Apache tribe. All right, now one night while we were playing there, I took a break, and we took a break, and I went over to the bar and sat down, and there was this older gentleman sitting next to me. At the time, I'd say he was in his 70s or 80s. He was very, very old. He looked very old, And we got to talking, and he started telling me this story about his grandfather, who back in 1881 was a missionary at a mission down in Las Cruces, New Mexico, down in the southern part of the state near the border. And he told me his grandfather had told him this story when he was young, and he had sworn by it all the way up until his grandfather died. And his grandfather died, he told me, when he was a sort of a young adult, which would have been maybe 50 or 60 years earlier, and say 1920 or so. But anyway, this was 1881 when his grandfather was referencing this period. And he was in his mission one night, and there was a knock at the door, and he opens the door, and it's this young guy he kind of looks very tired and worn, and his horse is all worn out, and the guy asks if he could have some food and water. He said, "I was told that I could get food and water here, and I could get water for my horse and maybe rest up the night." And so the guy said, "Of course, come on in." And he invites him in and gives him food and water, gives the horse water, lets him rest up. And the next morning, he got out, thanked the missionary lavishly, and rode out and rode for the border. And he told him that this was Billy the Kid, who was supposedly killed in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, by Pat Garrett. But Pat Garrett turns out to have been an old friend of Billy's, and instead of killing him, let him go with the admonition that that he better ride into Mexico and don't turn around, because if he ever did, Garrett would kill him on the spot. So Billy took the advice, and Garrett told him about the mission in Las Cruces, and Billy went to old Mexico, and he had met a Mexican woman down there, got work on a cattle ranch, I think, or something, settled down, had kids, had a big family, and periodically wrote letters to this guy's grandfather, the missionary, and he telling him of, keeping him up to date on how he was doing. So, and then the grandfather told this guy that I was talking to, the guy eventually told me that Billy died in Mexico around the early 1950s, a very old man in his 90s, and nobody ever learned that he had gone to Mexico outside of this missionary. And it had been rumored all along that Billy was not really killed in Fort Sumner by Pat Garrett, but nobody had any evidence. They just thought that might be the case. But this guy was willing to lay his life on the line that this was true. His grandfather had told him this, had sworn to it, and it was not just an old man telling a young kid some bullshit story that he wanted to hear, because he kept this story up until the guy was a young man, until the grandfather died. Anyway, I'd like to believe it, and that was the highlight of my trip to Ruidoso, New Mexico. Okay, so following Ruidoso, we go back to the Cellar Door. November 75 through January 76, back to the Cellar Door in Houston. And on January 10th of 1976, I split with Bob Danaher. Now, it turns out Bob fired me. And to tell you the truth, all these years later, I can't remember why. I don't know why. I thought we were getting along. Maybe we weren't, I don't know, but I thought we were getting along. I was enjoying myself, I know that, because I was still loving playing music every night and getting paid for it. But I know that Bob had made noises about wanting to have a bass player. And I think that might have been one of the overriding reasons why he fired me, was because he wanted to replace me with a bass player. Now, I understand that he did replace me with a bass player, but I don't know how it worked out, but I don't think it could have worked out too well, because every song we played, when I was playing with him, I took a solo, and that gave Bob a chance to just strum rhythm and rest his voice. But if he had a bass player, there'd be no solos. It'd have to be Bob singing all the way through. He couldn't play lead. He was not a lead player, just a rhythm player. And so he would have to sing all the way through every song, every night. And I don't think that did his voice any favors. So he didn't think that through too well, if that was the reason that he fired me. Maybe there was another reason, I don't know what it was. But whatever it was, I've long since forgiven him, And you know, may he rest in peace, by the way. He's gone. He passed away about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. And anyway, so after Bob fired me, I was on my own for the first time. Professional musician on my own. Now, I couldn't go back to advertising. It had been over 2 years, 2.5 years, and I was so I was real. I had to get work somewhere. I had to get a gig. So I went. I looked up work as a single. I tried to get work as a single, singing and playing. And so I scored a gig down in Richmond, Texas, a little, I won't call it a suburb. I think it's a suburb now, but back then it was a little town out in the country, southeast of Houston, at a place called the Brazos Bend Motel. And the Brazos Bend was sort of a flea bag motel with a rundown lounge attached to it. But the guy who ran it and his wife, they were very nice young people, and they hired me to play there 6 days a week. And in the afternoon, I think like 5 to 8 or something like that. And then on weekends they had a band, and so everything worked out. But I got to play my first gig as a single, and I wasn't very good. I have to say at this point, I've never been a good singer. I know that I'm not a good singer, and although I've tried hard, I've worked at it, but I could never cross over there's a line at which, if you're not a good singer, you can never cross over. And if you are a good singer, you're on the other side of that line. And no matter how you fuck up your voice with alcohol or drugs or anything like that, you can't cross over into being a bad singer. You can only get bad, but you still have that good voice remnant that people can recognize. But if you're a bad singer like me, you can never really become a good singer. But I tried to be a good singer. I tried, and I was a decent enough piano player by this time that I could fake it, And so I faked it from January to April at the Brazos Bend motel, and I was, I just did what I could. I played mostly country. I did some progressive country, but I was by now listening to all country, and getting away from the progressive country and into more hard country. So then about April '76, I get a call. By now I'm 31 years old, and I get a call from a guy. And by the way, this Brazos Bend gig, while it was not any better, and maybe necessarily not more lucrative than playing with Bob, it was better in the fact that it was more musically challenging, because I had to sing and play my way through the entire gig all by myself. I was responsible for how that gig went. It used to be Bob was responsible, and I just sat there and played piano. But now I was responsible. So that meant a step up for me. So yes, the Brazos Bend gig was better than playing with Bob Danaher at that time. So now in April 1976, I'm playing at the Brazos Bend, and I get a call from a bass player who's playing with Ben Reese. And Ben Reese was a guy, he was a country singer who was on 20th Century Records, which was a sort of a major label. And he had a record out that was a kind of a hit, a smallish hit record being played on the radio. And it was a familiar record. People knew his name. I mean, he was an older guy. He was, I'd say at the time, he was probably in his 40s or maybe 50 even. But he was, as a country artist, he was just up and coming. He hadn't had much of a background. He had no hit records before this. But he had this one hit record called It Don't Bother Me. And it was a sort of a minor hit at that time. And I had heard of him. I had heard it on the radio. And so his bass player said, look, we're looking for a piano player. You want to join us? And I said, well, sure. So the bass player came over one night with his bass, and we played a few tunes, and just so that he realized that I could play, and he hired me on the spot. And so I quit the Brazos Bend to go play with Ben Reese, who had a record deal. This is clearly a step up for me, playing with a guy who had a record out. And with Ben Reese, we traveled around. Didn't play too many dates because he didn't have that much work. But the ones that he had, they were all around Texas. We'd get in the van. He had a van, and we all piled into the van and drove hundreds of miles or wherever it was to play these dates with Ben. And they went pretty well. I mean, it was Ben and the bass player, El Ray Lee was the bass player. He was a really good singer. He fronted the band before we brought Ben up, and then a guitar player, myself, and a drummer, and that was the band. And so anyway, in July, I played with Ben through October of '76, and then I got a call then El Rey one night, when we had an off night, El Rey and I went to the Golden Stallion, which is a honky-tonk, Texas honky-tonk in Houston, to hear a band called Walt Jr. and the Country Division. And El Rey said, let's go, you got to hear these guys, they're pretty good. So we went to hear Walt Jr. and the Country Division, and they had guitar, bass, piano, and drums. Same combination that we had with Ben Reese. All right, so we played with him, and Walt knew El Rey from somewhere, and he recognized El Rey and asked him if he wanted to get up and do a song on bass. El Rey said, yeah. He said, now this is Mike, Ben's piano player. Can we get up and can he get up too? So Walt said, sure, come on up. So the two of us got up, and we did a song, I forget what, some country tune, or maybe a couple of country tunes that the drummer knew and Walt knew, and we did those songs, and then we got down. Okay, now it turns out about a couple of weeks later, I get a phone call from Walt Jr., and he wants to know if I want to join his band. And he said their piano player is quitting, and they said he would like for me to join his band. So I said, well, sure, because this represented a step up from Ben Reese. Ben was really going nowhere. He had his hit record, but it wasn't a big hit. And the 20th Century was talking about dropping him, and so he didn't really have much of a future in front of him. Walt Jr. was playing this Golden Stallion club, which is a big club. It sat about 400 people, and it was, I have to say, it was a B club. It was not one of the top clubs in Houston. They had top clubs like Western Swing and the Wells Fargo and these places that sat 1,000 people. Gillies, so thousands could get into Gillies, but the Golden Stallion was a B club, B-level club, and Walt Jr. was a B-level band. He didn't have the hottest players in town like these other bands did, but nevertheless, it was a step up for me because this was a real, authentic Texas honky-tonk where they played 5 nights a week, hardcore country, no Jerry Jeff Walker, no nothing, just all country. Merle Haggard, George Jones, hard country. So we played. I played with Walt Jr. because I needed that kind of experience. I knew I needed that kind of experience to hone my country chops. So I played with Walt Jr. from October '76 to July '78, almost 2 years. And we played we played the Golden Stallion almost that whole time. We played another club about the last month or so after that, but the Golden Stallion most of that time. And mixed in were some single dates that I still kept trying to do a single. On our off nights, we played Tuesday through Saturday at the Golden Stallion, and so on Sunday and Monday, I try to get dates here and there as a single in Houston, and still trying to make something click as a single, hoping that I could develop some kind of act. All right. So anyway, in July of '78, Walt Jr. fired me. What happened was in June of '78, my father got sick, and I had to go back to Seneca Falls, and I was gone for about a week, and then I came back, and then a couple weeks later he passed away, and so I had to go back for the funeral in July, and I was gone again for about another week, and I came back. Now the guy that substituted for me during those 2 separate weeks was a guy named Roy Weber. He's a good friend of mine. He was a good guy, very good singer, very good piano player, and when I got back, Walt had told me that they were just they were just going to go with Roy from that moment on. So I thought, okay, no hard feelings. The band, by the way, was Walt Jr., rest in peace, on guitar, Larry Raspberry on bass, myself on piano, and Joe Watson on drums. And before I got fired, when I was still with Walt, I have to mention about Joe Watson. Joe was a very good drummer, but more than that, he was a great singer, very soulful singer, and he did country, and he could do a lot of other things too, not just country. He could do, you name anything at all, and he'd do Lionel Richie. He could do it, right? And during that period of time, we became friends. During the 2 years that I was with Walt Jr., we became friends, Joe and I, and And I began to realize that he had just played drums because it was the first instrument he picked up, not because he was a natural drummer, but because he was a natural musician, and that was the first instrument he picked up. If he'd picked up guitar, he would have been a guitar player. Piano, pianist, whatever. He'd have picked up sax, he'd have been a saxophonist. But he picked up the drums, so he was a drummer, right? Anyway, I tried to tell him. I said, Joe, look, I said, you've got a future in this business. You can really make it, but you have to get out from behind those drums. Yeah, and I don't mean standing out front of a band singing. I mean playing an instrument. I said, what I would like to do is show you a few things about piano, so you can learn the elements of piano, and get yourself a single gig on piano, where you play, accompany yourself, and sing. And by doing that, you can really hone yourself, hone your artistry as a single, without having to worry about anybody else telling you what to do. And not only that, you get all the money, right? And all the attention and everything else that goes with it. So and then you can, as you hone your artistry, you can get that much closer to a record deal that much quicker, rather than singing one out of every 4 songs with Walt Jr., or any other band. This way you sing every song, and it's the Joe Watson show, with you on piano. You don't have to be a great pianist, but you do have to be able to accompany yourself in rudimentary style, and then just sing over it, and your singing will carry the day. All right, so I tried to tell him that, and I told him that over and over, and he well, I don't know, and he just wasn't thrilled with the idea, and I offered to come over and show him how to play the piano, and show him various little basic things, fundamentals, and but he just wouldn't snap to it. He just wouldn't do it. And after I left Walt Jr., I understand that he left sometime after that, not long after that, and became a used car salesman, which is too bad, because he had a great career in music in front of him if he had only wanted to take it. Now, it turns out Joe and I stayed friends all these years. We're friends to this day. We still talk on the phone periodically, and I love Joe. I think he's a great guy, and I will still to this day say that he could have had a great career in music, but we're still friends, and whatever he did, it's okay by me. All right, so that brings us to July '76, and I will sign off here, and we will take it up in the next episode.